Right, then let's
So,
switch to English.
yeah, let's now switch to English and let's start here. So, welcome back, everyone. I'm here with another episode with Mo. Is that your first name? Is that right?
Yes, that is my first name. That's a short version of my first
Okay,
name.
so what's
So
your full
the
first name then?
Moritz. It's
Oh, so you're
Morris.
Moritz. Okay,
It's the German version of Morris,
I see.
basically.
Hi.
But
Okay,
everyone
so
just calls me Mo.
everyone calls you Mo. Fine. So, Mo Magnan. It's a big honor to have you on, and thanks a lot for coming on. I've been following some of your stuff on Instagram for some time now, and it's been extremely informative because you're really good at diving pretty deep into the weeds, kind of going deep into the pathways and processes and explaining the physiology behind things. So that's been pretty informative and interesting. And there's still a couple questions that I'd like to talk to you about, especially surrounding insulin resistance, because that's something which I've been grappling with for a very long time, and I haven't quite figured it out. And so maybe we can kind of talk a bit more about that and see if we can get anywhere.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on the show.
Awesome.
And yeah, let's dive into the topic of insulin and also about
Yeah.
the Randall cycle.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we want to talk about because that topic is not really covered by a lot of people. I mean, there are so many camps that have their own viewpoint about what is the optimal diet for humans, but it can become very confusing for a lot of people because
Yeah.
there are so many different conflicting concepts out there. And the cool thing about the Randall cycle, once you understand it, you get an overarching principle where all those conflicting concepts can fit into and suddenly make sense.
Yeah.
And I like
Yeah.
that about this principle because you are not tied to a specific echo chamber. Yeah, so
Because
you get
it's
a
kind
higher
of like pure
understanding.
biochemistry and physiology. So it's not really a chamber. It's like, here you go. Here's how the body functions. Here is what happens. So you can't really. I mean, what nutritional camps are known for is that they really good at picking certain pathways and like super geeky biochemical stuff that no one understands, and cherry pick what could support their side that they promote, and then present it as if that's kind of the most important thing and the most important argument to be made to support their side. And then everyone who doesn't know anything about biochemistry or medicine or physiology just hears all these complicated terms and presumes that that person is knowledgeable. So it's tricky.
Yeah, exactly. And then if you would dare to tune into a different camp, then you would find some experts in that camp, and they will have their point of view with the same good arguments. And then afterwards, you're just gonna be confused because a lot of people then they dive into different topics, and then afterwards they're confused and they don't know what to follow anymore.
Right, right. So before we get super deep into like physiology, maybe discuss these concepts. We've already chatted a little bit before we started recording. Maybe tell the
Oh, okay,
viewers.
you're cutting off.
Okay, okay.
Cannot
So
hear you right now.
okay, can you hear me now? So okay. So how about now?
Yeah, now it's better. All
Okay,
right.
okay. Um, I was just saying that I first would like to introduce you, or I would like you to introduce yourself and tell us why people should should be listening to you. What is it you do? What is it What is it that you work with, and what is it you're interested in, and how did it came about?
Yeah, all right. Okay. So I am known mainly on Instagram
Mm,
for my profile, Mo Magnan.
mm-hmm,
So that is mo.magnan.
mm-hmm,
And that is a combination of my first name, Mo, and the term Cro-Magnon, which is the name of our ancestors who lived up until, I would say, 10,000 years ago. So the specific number is not clear. And their bones have been found in France in a valley called the Cro-Magnon Valley.
I see.
That's the actual correct pronunciation of that term, but it just got butchered into the English version, which is Cro-Magnon. And for branding reasons, I have combined it with my first name. So Mo plus Cro-Magnon becomes Mo Magnon.
Interesting.
And I have been experimenting with diet for a long time since my teenage years. So I'm now 32 years old. And back in the day, so in my late teenage years, I have struggled with a lot of health problems. It was not something very, very serious. So it was not something like a debilitating disease such as cancer or something like that. So it was not something like that. It was more like I was constantly sick. I always had something. My skin was terrible, and I just didn't feel good. So it was more like a generalized malaise that you could not really pinpoint. So, and in 2009, I guess, 2009. That's when I started looking into alternative diets. That was I started with a raw vegan diet.
Oh,
so
gosh.
I went into that direction and pretty radically. So I went fully raw vegan. And when I say raw vegan, I'm not just talking about that mainstream raw vegan where you have some kind of raw strawberry cheesecake in your raw vegan restaurant. But really, I went into the forest and gathered all those wild herbs, and I made smoothies not with spinach, but with stinging nettle, dandelion, and all kinds of other different wild herbs that I don't even know the name of in English.
Yeah.
And then, sure after that, I crashed on the raw vegan diet because, of course, it's a
How long were you on the diet?
diet. So I pushed myself to be there for almost 2 years. And after 2 years, I was done. I mean,
Wow.
it was basically that my body took over in a autopilot manner and just made me eat meat again.
Wow.
And once I started eating meat again, so I clearly remember that occasion when I first ate meat again. So I went to a kebab döner in Berlin. So at that time, I also lived in Berlin in Germany. And I just devoured that thing. I mean, I breathed it in, and it was like a switch went off. So all of a sudden, the brain fog disappeared. I had a rush of energy. Another thing that also reappeared was my sex drive, because before that, on a raw vegan diet, I was basically asexual for maybe half a year. Yeah. And I've heard the same story for a lot of people. Also women, they have lost their period for a lot of months. And so that basically told me, okay, look, this diet is not working out for you. You got to change your plans. And from then on, I dived into many different approaches. So I went into the paleo diet. That was in 2012. 2011, 2012. The paleo diet. Then afterwards, I went low carb, and I went into the keto route. I was on the keto diet for probably also 2 years, I would say, from 2015 to 2017. And later in 2019 until 2020, I was on the carnivore diet, even the raw carnivore. So I went through the whole spectrum. So from raw vegan all the way to raw carnivore. And I also stopped the carnivore diet in 2020. In late 2020. And I'm on an omnivorous diet, which is meat based, but I do have plant products. So
Right.
I'm not dogmatic about anything. I'm not dogmatic about animal products like the vegans. I'm not dogmatic about carbohydrates
Mm.
like the low carb keto people. Maybe the only thing that I am dogmatic about is to avoid industrial seed oils.
Right.
But other than that, I am pretty much open to using every food group. I mean, even in some cases, even legumes do have their place in a
Yeah.
diet. I mean, anti-nutrients, they bind to a lot of metals, and if you have too many anti-nutrients such as phytic acid, you can become demineralized. But on the other side, those anti-nutrients can also bind to heavy metals
Mm.
and can also help you to detox heavy metals. So in general, I am not opposed to any food group per se.
Mm. And that's, by the way, what I
Yeah.
enjoyed about your content, because I've been seeing you posting different things, different content on information, of information on Instagram. And it's been
Yeah,
quite
I
interesting to follow
started out
you
with it.
because you were criticizing different approaches. Because oftentimes when you see someone in any camp that's promoting, let's say, animal foods, oftentimes it's a keto person or a low carb person or a carnivore person, and you would not
Yes,
necessarily expect that person to be particularly critical of the ketogenic idea, kind of that carbohydrates are evil, which you criticize, which I find nice, because I think that's something to that requires a more nuanced approach, apart from just saying, well, this is poison, you
yeah,
should just avoid
yeah,
that. And
exactly.
I had
Thank
many
you.
many interesting conversations and episodes on the problems regarding dogmatic approaches in diet, and why this is something to be avoided. But yeah, so and that's what I think you're pretty good at. So appreciate you for doing this. Definitely.
Oh yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, thank you for telling me that.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I mean, in the beginning, when I started my Instagram account in late 2019, I started with this infamous anti-veganism advent calendar. So
Mm.
those were 24 posts with an argument against veganism. So 24 arguments against veganism. And at that point, I was on the carnivore diet. I never explicitly promoted going carnivore. So that was just an experiment, which I have stopped later on. But yeah, I think that some people in the beginning have put me into that camp.
Mm.
And I went into different directions where I would also call out the low carb keto people,
Yeah.
and that's basically where we are going to go with the talk today,
Mm.
because that insulin signaling problems are not being solved with a ketogenic diet on the long run,
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm.
is something that most people would think, well, what is he talking about? Of course, you're becoming more insulin sensitive, because there are a lot of people who have been overweight or obese, and then they have gone on a low carb ketogenic diet and they have lost a tremendous amount of weight.
Mm.
And it feels like a full-blown success.
Mm.
The thing is that for some people, I'm not saying that everyone should change that approach, but for some people, it can backfire in the long run. So in the short term, it's very beneficial, but then the very same diet can backfire
Mm.
for a lot of people. So
Right.
the best known examples is Jimmy Moore from Viva La Vida Low Carb. And yeah, he recently got arrested
Mm.
because of because he had sex with a 13-year-old, so he's now in jail. So it's now
Oh man.
living la vida locked up. So yeah, but basically what happened to him, he was morbidly obese. Then he went on a low carb ketogenic diet and he lost a tremendous amount of weight. And then he stayed on that diet and he gained back all that weight.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
And people thought, what is going on here? Why is that happening? And in my coaching, I also had some clients who were obese even on a carnivore diet.
Right.
And that's one thing that you never hear about, because most of the time when there are people who are following a certain approach, they they go online after they had their success stories, because they want to have their shining before after pictures, and that's what they what's the topic of their Instagram account,
Right.
basically. So this is how I lost weight and stuff. And there are very few people who are coming online and share their experience when they were not successful. So I tip my hat to those people, because that gives very important insight into into people who are not successful
Well,
with
even
it.
scientifically, right?
And
Because you cannot, if you have a success story, you could take it as proof for like that the diet has worked, which is not how it works generally speaking. Because usually you
I mean,
try the
this
concept and
particular person that worked, yeah.
right, and if you refute the concept, if you have examples that show something didn't work, then that's actually something you should be attending more towards, because that can give you actually can scientifically can give you more insight into what is actually going on. Because how, like, you don't know why things work and why things happen. You know, the reasons for why people lost weight on a specific diet could be manifold. But if they tried something and they failed, well, let's take a look. Maybe there's something to learn from.
Yeah, exactly. Because when you only look at the successful people, then that's the way into the echo chamber mentality.
Absolutely.
But when you are coaching other people and you get the other side of those diets with people who have not been successful with that, then you as a coach, you have to take that into consideration, because otherwise, yeah, because you want to help people. And if they cannot lose weight on a ketogenic diet or even on a carnivore diet, then yeah, you have to re-examine your entire approach, which does not mean that I am against keto or against carnivore. I still recommend carnivore for people who have debilitating autoimmune issues,
Yeah.
because it's an amazing reset diet for people who have failed with everything else, and it's basically their last resort. But then in terms of weight loss, yeah, for a lot of people it also works, but then there are other people where it does not work. And the thing is, so here, this is where we get into the topic with the insulin
Yep.
signaling. The reason why a lot of low carb ketogenic diets work um, to make people lose weight is not because they heal insulin resistance, or it's not that they heal the defective insulin signaling pathway, but rather they avoid using that pathway.
Yeah.
And when you avoid using something, you get the impression that you're healing, but avoiding is not the same as actual healing. So let me give you a metaphor or an analogy. So a little trigger warning before, because it's a bit of a dark analogy, but
Just go ahead.
uh, it's something that, yeah, it's I couldn't find a better example.
Yeah.
So let's say there's a person who gets raped, okay? And then after this very traumatizing experience, they stop having any sexual activity with anyone. So they don't want to be intimate with anyone because it triggers them. And with this avoidance strategy, they don't have those triggers anymore. But the problem is, if you're just avoiding it, you down the line, you can have some other problems. I mean, in terms of physical intimacy, human beings need physical intimacy. And if you deprive yourself of that, you can have another all kinds of other problems down the road. I mean, there are these experiments where they looked at what happened when
Oh no. Jesus Christ. What happened? Bruh. Come on. Here we go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Hey, yeah, we're back. Whatever
How are you?
happened.
We're still recording?
Yeah, we're still recording.
Yeah, man, I
So
got kicked out because the topic was too triggering.
maybe that's the reason. So you were mentioning, you were about to mention an experiment, maybe.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
there was this experiment where baby did not receive any love,
Oh yeah.
any human touch. So they were provided with everything they needed. So they
Right.
got food, they got shelter, they got their all the hygienic needs met, but they did not get any affection, and as a result, the babies died. So as an adult, you're not gonna die if you deprive yourself of intimacy and human touch, but you're still gonna suffer in other ways.
True.
And that's the thing. So when you avoid something, you're not healing it.
Yeah, it's
And
interesting.
I
If let me make a quick comment on that, because it's interesting you bring up this psychological example, because the funny thing is that in psychology and in like psychotherapy, that's exactly the opposite of what you should do. Like if there is a problem, if there is a trauma, if there's like a past experience, then the right thing to go about healing it is to face it, like voluntarily face it and encounter the most horrible thing you could imagine, basically. And that's how you can. It's not exactly that you can in this way that you can sort of throw the fear out of the window. Like this doesn't really happen, but you find out that you're actually more courageous than you think and braver than you think, and that you're actually capable of doing it, and that's how it works. But it's actually a good analogy to draw, that by avoiding it doesn't necessarily become better.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's okay if you avoid it for the short term, so you don't have to jump right back into some triggering experience. But in that example, maybe that person would go to therapy and then find a partner that they really trust, and then approach that topic of physical intimacy in that safe environment. So approach it and then heal it. So if you're avoiding it for a short term, that's fine. Yeah.
Sure.
And the thing, so to go back to the topic of insulin resistance, so if you have defective insulin signaling pathway, it's totally fine to avoid using that pathway for some time. So if you go on a low carb ketogenic diet and you are avoiding to use the insulin pathway, you can make great progress
Yeah.
in the short term and in the midterm. But the problem is that when people stay on that diet for too long, so they chronically avoid that pathway. And what happens is that a lot of people can completely screw up that pathway
Right.
in the long run. And it's basically insulin receptors are like muscles. Use it, lose it.
Right.
So if you avoid using your insulin receptors in the long run, after a few years, you can completely lose your insulin sensitivity
Right.
for good. And then you're really screwed.
And I mean, that makes also total physiological sense if you think about it for a bit. Like, if you stop using a pathway that's, by the way, really expensive because you have to manufacture all that enzymatic machinery all the time. And that's like, it's not a trivial process and requires lots of energy. So if the cell recognizes there is no need to use these enzymes to, like the glycolytic enzymes, let's say, then what just happens is the cell will shut off the machinery to produce, to transcribe, like the whole genetic machinery to produce these enzymes, these proteins. And then if suddenly you start eating, carbs again, etc., then you won't have the capacity to dispense with carbohydrates in a proper manner, which is what the keto diet, keto folks oftentimes refer to as sort of physiological insulin resistance, which is true to a certain extent, because obviously if you'll eat it for a bit, then as far as my understanding goes, if you start eating carbohydrates again, if you introduce them back, then after a while you will remake that machinery, and then after some time you would technically be able to process them again. So is that right?
Exactly. So that physiological insulin resistance is not permanent. As soon as you eat carbohydrates, then the doors open again, and then all of a sudden the insulin receptors are working fully fine again.
Yeah.
But problem is that physiological insulin resistance can actually turn into pathological insulin resistance after a few years.
And how does that work?
It's a lot of
How does that work physiologically?
It's basically, like you just said, that the body just stops producing certain enzymes, and in the long run, it's even that the insulin receptors themselves can atrophy in the long run, and then you completely lose your insulin signaling pathway.
Would you say this is reversible? Like, imagine someone staying on the keto diet for 10 years and they have increased their amount of insulin resistance that's not physiological by a fair extent, and then they start eating reasonable amounts of carbohydrates again. Would you say this state is, reversible by any means, or is it something that stays to a certain extent, remains permanent?
I know from some people who have told me that even after years, they have not fully regained their sensitivity fully. So you can reverse it, but in very severe cases, it can take years. So the thing is, what I want to focus on is not to see insulin as an enemy,
right,
but something that you have to heal. So you don't have to work against insulin, you have to work with insulin.
Yeah.
You wanna regain your insulin sensitivity.
Right, and let's back off one or two steps before we start talking about healing and what you can do, because first we need to understand diabetes, we need to understand insulin resistance. And I had a very hard time understanding insulin resistance because oftentimes the explanations are really vague and they're pretty unsatisfactory, as far as I'm concerned, because they just don't make full sense. And I like to understand the disease on many different levels, not just on a physiological level, but also on evolutionary level, especially if it affects so many people. And I have a question to you, which is basically, what do you think about an evolutionary explanation to insulin resistance or diabetes, let's say? Because you might think, well, my question always was, why does the body react the way it reacts? Because the cell become insulin resistant. And we think that's a bad thing. And clearly it is a bad thing, because then you have high blood sugar and all the problems associated with diabetes. And we can maybe get more clear on what exactly that means, because like people think it's just like, I don't know, it's like just high blood sugar period, but it's associated with many more problems. And the question always was, for me at least, why does the cell react with insulin resistance in the first place? Then like, what exactly does that mean, insulin resistance, on a biochemical level? And why does the cell actually refers to that state, falls back to that state? Like, what's the explanation for why certain processes take place in the cell that render the cell insulin resistant? Hope that question makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It's a that's the direction I also wanted to go with the conversation. So insulin resistance basically comes from a survival mechanism.
Right.
Because when you don't have food, I mean, in nature, you cannot eat pasta and ice cream. So when you don't have food, when you're on a food shortage, then your muscles have to become temporarily insulin resistant, so that they only gonna run on fatty acids and not snatch that little glucose that you still have, which is reserved for the brain. Because the brain can partially run on ketones, but not 100%. So even if you're in the deepest ketosis, the brain can only utilize, I don't know exactly the percentage, maybe 80% ketones, but the last 20% are still glucose dependent. So you cannot run 100% on ketone bodies.
And there's also other parts of the body that are kind of more glucose dependent, like there's red blood cells, for example, and the lens in the eye. There's like certain cells that only have anaerobic metabolism. So there's certain parts of the body that are clearly dependent on glucose.
Yeah, exactly, because the red blood cells don't have a nucleus, they don't have mitochondria. Because they just, that was an adaptation to make more room for oxygen, so they can carry as much oxygen as possible. So when you don't have any sugar, any carbohydrates, or any glucose in your bloodstream, then your cells gonna switch to a fat burning mode, and they become insulin resistant to preserve that little glucose that you still have for the brain. And this is basically done by a negative feedback loop. So for anyone who doesn't know what a negative feedback loop is, that's basically what we know from the toilets in the bathroom. So when you flush the toilet, the tank of the toilet gets emptied, and then it refills afterwards. And there is a ball swimming on the water, which is connected to a valve. And once the water level reaches a certain point, then the ball swims so high that the valve closes, and then the influx of more water gets blocked. So this is a negative feedback loop where water blocks the influx of more water. Yeah. And in cells, we have a similar negative feedback loop that is connected to our ATP production, the cellular production, and one of the intermediate products of that ATP production is acetyl-CoA. And both carbohydrates and fatty acids produce acetyl-CoA, but fatty acids produce much more acetyl-CoA than carbohydrates. So let's say if you are in a fasting mode and there's not enough glucose, then the fatty acids produce so much CoA that this cellular, let's call it the toilet tank, is maybe filled 60%, 70%, 80%, whatever. And the threshold that cuts off carbohydrate influx is maybe at 50%. Okay, so when fatty acids stream into the cells, they block the metabolization of glucose. Right. And that is basically how the cells become temporarily, physiologically insulin resistant, to spare glucose until you eat something again. Okay? And this is basically it's a survival mechanism.
Yep.
The problem is that in our modern world, we have this overabundance of foods that have both fatty acids, lots of fat, and sugar in it. Things like ice cream, chocolate, and all that stuff.
Right.
And here's what happens. I've just talked about one side of this Randle cycle, how fatty acids block glucose from being metabolized in the muscle. The other side of the Randle cycle is that once you eat glucose, then you start producing more insulin, and insulin in turn closes another valve, and that is from the fatty acids to release from the fat cells to release fatty acids. So it's a bit hard to explain that without in infographics. I mean, on my Patreon account, I'm explaining all that with infographics. So basically, how you can understand it is that glucose blocks the release of fatty acids from the adipose tissue via insulin.
Yep.
And fatty acids, in turn, block the influx of glucose into the muscles.
Yep.
And the problem is when you eat both at the same time, glucose and fatty acids, they block each other. So they basically cancel each other out. And this is why when you go on a low carb diet, you're taking glucose out of the equation so that your body can fully focus on burning fatty acids. Whereas when you go on a high carb, low fat diet, which is what a lot of vegan people do, you're taking fat out of the equation, and then your body can fully focus on glucose. And this is why both those opposing approaches lead to fat loss and to a healthier metabolism. And this does not mean that I am against eating a combination of carbs and fats at all time. So when you're slim and you're physically active, you can easily metabolize glucose and fatty acids at the same time, because once you do physical exercise, you are activating certain receptors in the cell, certain GLUT4 receptors. So GLUT4 is a glucose transporter number 4,
Right.
and they are non-insulin dependent. So
maybe that's super interesting for people to understand, because right, just elaborate maybe on that. What exactly does that mean?
Sorry,
because sorry?
You were breaking off a little bit.
How about now?
Yeah, now it's better.
Okay, so yeah, that's just to quickly interject here, because that's what I find extremely fascinating, which is touching on how do we kind of heal or reverse or treat type 2 diabetes / insulin resistance, since you could just induce non-insulin dependent glucose transporters in your damn muscles by exercising, which is like brilliant.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
brilliant. It's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Move, and your body will just suck in glucose. It's insane, actually, if you think about it.
In some cases, however, so in very severe cases, when people are severely obese, they don't have a physiological response to exercise. So their response is going to be a stress response, which then just going to releases cortisol, and which is then activating the Randle cycle again with lots of fatty acids coming from their fat cells, and also lots of glucose being released by cortisol.
Yep.
And then they're canceling out everything again. So if someone is morbidly obese, they have to start with very strenuous exercise, like just walking, taking a walk every day. That is not too stressful. And for them, the approach would be either a low carb diet, which is slightly hypocaloric, so you're eating slightly less calories, or if they are not properly responding to that, then it would actually be a low fat approach, So in both approaches, you want to be high protein, but in one approach you would be low carb, and in the other one you would be low fat. And depending on the person, some people react better to this, and other people are reacting better to the other one. And then you can slowly reverse that. But yeah, it's a bit tricky to do that, but yeah, you basically want to keep your blood glucose level at a very, very steady level. So you high carb diet, you would not do this with sugar or drinking juices or something.
Right.
So you do this with slow carbs and also with fiber. I mean, a lot of people in the carnivore community are totally against fiber and vegetables, and I was like that for some time as well, but I have rediscovered the value of fiber.
Sure.
Basically. Yeah.
I agree, and I find, like, going on a like quick tangent here, but not too much, which is the whole vegetable anti-nutrient fiber whatever argument. I think there's like some truth, and the truth is just that these anti-nutrients, or talking about anti-nutrients, that they do exist, but that doesn't mean anything, because it's just like they exist and a cow eats only plants and it doesn't die. So just the mere existence of these anti-nutrients doesn't tell you anything about how an organism would respond to these nutrients. And like kind of same goes for fiber, like only because it might be triggering or maybe like potentially harmful, producing certain symptoms, gastrointestinal symptoms for some individuals, doesn't always imply that you should just avoid fiber altogether at all costs. I think that's it's same for like it. You can make the same argument for literally every dietary intervention. It's like for some people it produces benefit, for some it seems to be harmful, and it doesn't mean it's bad or good. It means have it as a toolkit. Use it for some people, like ketogenic diet. We talked about ketogenic carnivore diets. Ketogenic diets have been developed for epileptic patients, and they work great. Like these people have less symptoms, like awesome. Or certain neurological conditions, ketogenic diet seems to be extremely helpful. And carnivore diet seems to be helpful for folks with autoimmune issues. It's like, there you go.
Yes, absolutely. So for temporary purpose, I still recommend those diets. So I'm not against those diets.
Sure.
I don't say, oh, this is bullshit, to refer to a certain influencer who's you know who I'm talking about, right?
Well, yeah. Well, I think he's quite popular, so maybe we can say who it is. So we're talking about Paul. We're talking about Paul Saladino, Carnivore MD.
Yeah.
Right. He's pretty funny. I find that actually quite amusing. So I like watching his videos because, I like that he's going against this mainstream vegan nonsense. Or like, props for that, but it's still a little ridiculous.
Yeah. Absolutely. So everyone has their place in this whole should I call it the nutrition war? I don't know, but yeah, everyone has their place to fight at a certain front. And yeah, so yeah, he's doing a pretty good job to be against this whole vegan propaganda that wants to put everyone on a whole vegan diet.
Yeah.
But
maybe let's get back for a second to the first question we had, which was, and I still want to ask you one more thing, since you explained the evolutionary basis of insulin resistance in the setting of food deprivation, aka kind of starvation, fasting, whatever, where the cells, which is basically a ketogenic state, right? Your metabolism starts running on fat and ketones. Right, on fat and like endogenous fat stores and ketones, and then there is no need for the cells to have the machinery to dispense with glucose, and then you kind of become physiologically insulin resistant. But that's not the same thing that happens in the modern environment, isn't it? Since we have damn, I forgot the word.
Yeah,
you have too many calories available. An overall availability of calories, and people overeat, and then weird stuff starts happening to the cells as a consequence of which they start becoming insulin resistant. And that's a different process. And so what would you say about that? Because that's not the same thing as food deprivation where you start becoming insulin resistant. It's something different. And I've heard someone else on a different podcast, I forgot who exactly it was, and the theory basically was the cell, it's a protective mechanism because too many calories would start would like kind of produce too much oxidative stress, damage the mitochondria, which is worse than insulin resistance. So it's kind of the cells just pick the better option. So they could pick between letting in more and more calories and become stuffed and like die because too much oxidative stress and mitochondrial damage, or just shut off, leave the glucose outside, and continue to exist. And that's basically what the body does.
Yeah, so basically, the underlying mechanism is still kind of the same because the way that cells become physiologically insulin resistant is by being exposed to a lot of fatty acid influx. Yeah, so fat makes insulin resistant. So I know that everyone in the alternative realm thinks that this is just some bullshit from mainstream, but it's actually true that when your cells are presented to fat, they become temporarily insulin resistant. And then when you have both fat and sugar at the same time, the sugar cannot enter the cells, so it gets converted. It gets converted into fat, goes into the adipose tissue, and then over time, what happens is that the adipose tissue becomes more and more, and after a while, the adipose cells also become insulin resistant.
Right.
So then they and this is the point when they cannot react to this on-off switch that is mediated by insulin. So when you then eat sugar, the cells, the adipose tissue should actually close the valve of releasing more fatty acids into the bloodstream. But since the adipose tissue has also become insulin resistant, it does not react to that insulin signal anymore and keep just leaking fatty acids into the bloodstream.
Right.
And this is when really shit hits the fan, when people become really completely insulin resistant.
Well, then they present themselves with high triglycerides and stuff like that. So that's kind of what also, or a high free fatty acid count. And then there is other stuff going on. It's like when diabetes seriously gets out of control, it's when the liver starts becoming extremely insulin resistant, because then what happens is essentially that you have no insulin signaling at the level of the liver, and then just gluconeogenesis continues because insulin shuts off gluconeogenesis. And what else continues? The same thing with that happens to the fat cells, and then the liver starts producing triglycerides and leaking them. So then you have problems.
Exactly. So the fat cells are constantly leaking fatty acids, and the liver is constantly leaking glucose into the bloodstream, and then you're basically constantly activating the Randle cycle. And this is when you're really in big trouble. So the only way to get out of this is by going a hypocaloric diet that is either low fat or low carb. Until you have reached a healthy body weight, which means that less fat is going to be, or less fatty acids are going to be released into the bloodstream by your adipose tissue. And also your liver is also becoming healthier because there's so much fat in the liver. And then from there on, then you can do another intervention. I mean, what this guy, Jimmy Moore, should have done is, as soon as he reached his goal weight with a ketogenic diet, he should have focused on regaining his insulin sensitivity again.
Yeah.
And actually go on a high carb diet.
Right.
Or maybe not high carb, because that sounds like you're just eating sugar and stuff, but a low fat, medium carb, high protein diet.
Right.
And this is how you finally get your insulin sensitivity back. And also, of course, you have to take in a lot of micronutrients. So you need all those minerals and you need those
Like
B
B vitamins,
vitamins,
right.
that stuff. Because glucose, the metabolism is much more expensive than the fatty acid metabolism. So it costs a lot more cofactors. It's a much more expensive metabolism, but you want to keep using that metabolism, because once you lose that anabolic pathway, in the long run, it can backfire on things like your thyroid,
Oh
on
yeah.
things like your stem cells and all that stuff. So you still want to have a functioning insulin signaling
Oh,
pathway.
kidney as well, right? Like we
Yeah,
recently
yeah,
had
yeah.
kidney module in medical school, which was super interesting, and no one specifically pointed their fingers at this pathway, but they kind of mentioned it, and I could finally connect the dots, and it started making sense why like Paul Saladino and the other people have been talking about like electrolyte shit that is going on in keto and why carbs help. I'm like, how exactly does that work? And the way it works is that insulin is required to activate transport systems, especially the sodium potassium channel, is being activated or stimulated by insulin signaling, and it's important for secreting potassium in the urine and resorbing, putting sodium back into the bloodstream, which is what happens in the kidney. And so if people go ketogenic and they have very low insulin signaling for a long time, then they lose too much sodium and they keep too much potassium. And what happened to Paul Saladino after his ketogenic diet is he started, like, he talked about heart palpitations, which is oftentimes a result of too much potassium in the blood. And other electrolyte imbalances like low sodium might have also manifested themselves. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's quite fascinating.
Yeah, and what's also interesting is that on my 2 years of keto, I developed tinnitus,
Oh,
and I have successfully reversed it with more carbohydrates and some other interventions.
wow.
But yeah, so I'm still a fan of those interventions in the short term, but in the long term, from my own experiences and also from experiences that I had with coaching clients, I don't recommend it for everyone anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some exceptions. There are some people who are on a zero carb diet for 10 plus years and they're still doing good. But then again, there are also some people who are on a vegan diet for 10 plus years
And they're doing good, yeah.
and somehow manage to make it work. So I call those people the error in the matrix,
Haha.
because yeah, it's some people
Well,
make it
it's
work.
also, the question is how much do these people really adhere to their diets? Because I have some friends who they follow the vegan diet for some time and they kind of transitioned back to a normal omnivore, maybe even like more animal based diet. I have some of these friends,
Every time
and
when they eat, huh?
and there's one which I tell about him all the time because he's an interesting example. He told me that as far as he was concerned and other vegans were concerned, like they all just crave animal foods and they have these moments where they just forget what they're doing and subconsciously they go grab some animal's food, eat it and forget about it. And that's sometimes what happens to vegans. And who knows, maybe ketogenic people, they just they binge on sugar one day and then they're fine and they continue going, living their keto lifestyle. So the question for those folks who stick to the diet allegedly for such a long time is how well do they really adhere to the diet 100% religiously? Like, I doubt it, because really it's quite something.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's what happened to me when I was vegan and when I just went on autopilot and I started
Right.
just meat,
Right.
because my body said, okay, it's enough. So I'm gonna take over now, and you're gonna eat those nutrients.
Right.
Enough of that vegan bullshit.
But that's, hey, that's
Yeah.
that's a different issue. I wanna ask you two questions on the insulin resistant front, and one about the Randall cycle, which is how do you think, in your opinion, how much does it all happen and work independent of calories? Because that's a very interesting and important thing to take into account, I believe. Since you could just as well make the argument, look, if you're eucaloric, if you don't hypocaloric, if you eat the right amount of calories, then what happens is just you have enough energy, you burn it, and everything is fine, and you shouldn't technically develop any problems. And how much do you think do these problems occur because of a chronic hypercaloric state, and or how much is the problems connected to the Rendell cycle independent of that? And the next question connected to that would be then, why do certain people that are not overweight or seem to have a normal body weight still develop insulin resistance? Because I've never been able to figure that out.
Okay, so it's good that you talk about calories, because
Right.
there are also a lot of people who say calories don't matter.
Oh, that's stupid.
Which is also wrong, because the thing is, there are two camps. The one camp says calories are the only thing that matters, and if you're in your caloric window, you can eat donuts and stuff like that, which is BS.
Right.
On the other hand, there are people who say, no, calories don't matter. As long as you eat the right foods, you can eat as much as you want, which is also BS. So the thing is, both the quantity, which is the calories, and the quality of your food matters. It's not one or the other, it's both. So you can actually go into ketosis on a high carb, low fat diet if you are only eating, let's say, potatoes. I mean, there's this book, it's called The Potato Hack, and you eat nothing but potatoes, and because you're so hypocalorically in your food intake, because I mean, potatoes are very stuffing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're very hypocaloric, and you're still gonna be in ketosis even though you eat basically nothing but potatoes. So you're super high carb, zero fat diet, and you still go into ketosis in that regard. So yeah, the problem that we have is definitely the wrong food combination, as well as too much calorie intake. So it's because of this hyper palatability of junk food. So junk food is basically the worst thing that you can put into your body, because number one, you constantly combine fat and sugar. Yeah, you have your French fries, which are drowned in fat. And then you have your burger with the fatty patty, and then you have the carbohydrates from the potatoes and from the bun and from the drink, which is the worst combination that you can have.
Yeah.
And then also because there are all those what is it called, flavor enhancers. Yeah, it becomes hyper palatable, and then you eat an excess amount of calories.
Yeah, exactly. And then look, we should give these people their due, because the argument basically is you eat too many calories, because it's so hyper palatable, as you just described, which is like perfect. Of course, it's hyper palatable. Like, think about this this combination. Then you have like salt. Like, here you go, eat as much as you want, and then you overeat, and then you eat too many calories, and you keep stuffing your fat cells, and then you become insulin resistant. And so that's the argument. And so how much do you think is, look, say you're normal weight and you don't overeat, would you still, but you keep combining fats and carbohydrates, how much does that create problems in the long run, as far as the Rendell cycle is concerned?
Yeah, it depends on the type of calories. So for example, if you drink sugar, the problem is that liquid sugar makes your blood glucose levels spike like nothing else. I mean, even eating a donut is not as bad as drinking liquid sugar. So that means that you have so much glucose in your bloodstream that your mitochondria cannot get rid of it or cannot metabolize it quickly enough. So part of it gets converted into fat.
Mm-hmm.
And
Well, glycogen
then,
first.
yeah. I mean, in a sedentary
Yeah,
lifestyle, the
sure.
glycogen storages are
Oh,
already
full.
filled to the
Haha.
max.
True.
And then it gets converted into fat. I mean, that's another argument for physical exercise, so that you keep your glycogen storages empty, so that you have this capacity to deal with this influx of glucose. And then the other portion of the sugar, which is the fructose, goes into the liver, which also overwhelms the liver and turns into fatty acids. So you are activating the Randle cycle by that. And then also, if you have things like a lot of PUFAs in your diet, I mean, that's another problem of the standard American, or in general the junk food diet, is that all that stuff is fried in vegetable oils.
Yeah.
And those PUFAs, they are so destructive to our cells. They're so toxic. They also damage our insulin receptors even more. And this is how a person who is normal weight can also become insulin resistant. And then also, the third factor is because they don't take in any micronutrients, because the insulin receptors need micronutrients.
Right.
So if you have low mineral intake, low B vitamin intake, because you never eat liver or other organ meats, of course, then your insulin receptors ultimately are also gonna go to waste. And then even with a hypocaloric intake, you can still become insulin resistant.
Right.
So the thing is, you want to have high quality foods. So you want to have good foods that you eat, and at the same time, you also don't want to overeat, which is usually the case because whole foods, natural foods, are not as hyper palatable or as is junk food.
True. Right. And
So your question.
Yep. Go ahead.
And the second question, what was that again?
Oh, so I kind of combined two questions. The first one was basically how much of a role do calories play? Oh, no. Yeah. Independent. No. How much does this Randle cycle influence, the activation of the Randle cycle influence insulin resistant, independent, like apart from the calorie thing? Because it's hard. It's hard, and it's still hard for me to make sense of that, since say you presented the example of the glucose drink, and we always think of someone who is sedentary and overweight, because that's obviously matters, since someone doesn't move, eats only processed food, and it's hyperpalatable, and the person gains a lot of weight. But take as an example, that person drinks soda, etc., but is eucaloric, no overconsumption of calories here. It's still sedentary, etc. And then you might make the argument. By the way, I'm not saying anyone should engage in that sort of behavior, just for the sake of example. Say that person is sedentary, doesn't really move, and has full glycogen stores, etc. Then what would happen in a eucaloric state, which means not too much, not too little calories? That person would drink a bunch of soda. Glucose would spike, which is bad by itself, but would still spike. And then the cells would take it up. They're still full of glycogen, but they would maybe convert it into fat. And then because that person still has a certain basal metabolic rate and maybe has some NEAT going on, some non-exercise thermogenesis, and, moves around a little bit and just, has some activities going on, then that person maybe burns off 2,000 calories a day, and they might use that energy to burn it off. So the glycogen stores still remain full. They don't empty their fat cells or their glycogen stores, but what they eat, they burn off again. So technically, I can see the argument how this would technically don't produce any problems, given that you have enough nutrients to let the machinery run. So I'm trying to figure out how much of this is a problem if you account for the calorie problem. you know?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the thing is, it's a it's not a black and white issue.
Sure.
So yeah, the calories, if they take care of the calories, they have maybe half the equation solved.
Mm,
But if their diet is still poor, that thing can still mess up their metabolism.
mm.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's a little difficult.
It's take longer. It's just gonna take longer. So it's not gonna be as quickly as someone who overeats on junk food. But if they don't have the right nutrients, and if they destroy their insulin receptors with things like PUFA intake,
Mm,
they're still gonna develop those problems later on down the road.
right, right. And
Just gonna take longer.
I fully agree. I'm just trying to figure out how exactly does that works on a more like physiological level. But maybe like you mentioned PUFAs now a couple times, and I like completely on your side as far as PUFAs are concerned. I'm not a fan of them at all. But you know, maybe you're probably familiar with Lane Norton, BioLane. Know him?
Uh, huh?
Do you know him?
Can you?
BioLane, Lane Norton.
Oh yeah.
Right, right. And he likes, I kind of like him. He's funny and he's pretty reasonable. But you know, he presented some arguments against, no, what would you say? He presented certain arguments that go against the idea that PUFAs are harmful. And I just want to recapitulate them and see what you have to say about them, because it's quite tricky. He likes saying that there is no like real evidence to point at, apart from rodent studies and certain theoretical biochemical pathways that might explain how PUFAs are dangerous. Because if we look like at randomized controlled trials, then what we see is that we have better outcomes if people substitute PUFAs for if they substitute something else for PUFAs. So just question on that. What do you think is actually going on, and how would you, what evidence would you provide to support that?
Yeah, I know especially in the repeat community, people are totally against PUFAs, not only the vegetable oils, but also against fish, fish oil. I mean, I am against taking fish oil in most cases. Sometimes it can be beneficial, but yeah, the omega-3 fatty acids can also become free radicals, things like malondialdehyde. And that does not mean that I am totally against PUFAs, because PUFAs in small amounts are still considered essential fatty acids. I mean, back in the days when PUFAs were discovered, they were actually called vitamin F.
Interesting.
And they were only later reclassified as omega fatty acids. And I like the term vitamin F because it gives us a hint that we should only consume them as a micronutrient.
In tiny amounts.
You don't want to use PUFAs for your caloric needs, because in
I see.
amounts that are large, they still become very, very bad. And the thing is that our cells are made up of this phospholipid bilayer.
Yep.
Yeah. And basically this layer is like a wall with different openings inside that wall. So it's like a room. So if you think of your cell, it's like a room, and it has many doors where you can enter the cell, and nutrients can come into the cell. And the thing is, if you have a too high amount of saturated fatty acids in your diet, you can actually make this wall impenetrable. And this is why in the mainstream media or in the mainstream academics, you always hear that saturated fat makes you insulin resistant. And the alternative nutrition scene has gone against that. And the thing is, I actually have to agree to a certain extent that saturated fatty acids can indeed make you insulin resistant if you have too much of those
Right.
incorporated into your cell's membrane. Because so we are always talking, everyone is always talking about this ratio between omega-6 and omega-3, but there's another fatty acid ratio that we have to take care of, and that is the ratio of saturated fatty acids to monounsaturated omega-9 fatty acids. And you only eat butter and coconut oil, something that is very high in saturated fatty acids, you can actually turn your cell membranes into impenetrable walls. And to reverse that, you would have to eat more unsaturated fatty acids to make that wall become more penetrable again.
Yeah.
And this is why animal products are so good, because meat in particular, like beef and pork, has the perfect ratio of saturated fatty acids and monounsaturated fatty acids. So it's almost 50-50. So if you eat nothing but meat, like beef and bacon and that stuff, as your fat source, you have the perfect ratio between those two fatty acids. However, if you only eat butter and coconut oil, they have a much higher percentage of saturated fatty acids, and then you can actually become insulin resistant from that. And what a lot of scientific experiments have found out, that if you put people on a PUFA diet, their insulin resistance or their insulin sensitivity becomes better. Whereas if you put people on a strictly saturated fatty acid intake diet, their insulin resistance becomes worse. And now they, in their black and white thinking, they only think that saturated fatty acids are bad, which is also not the case. So you need a balance. You need saturated fatty acids, but you also need monounsaturated fatty acids. Because if you go too far into the other direction with MUFAs and PUFAs, what then happens is that those fatty acids become incorporated into the membrane of your mitochondria, and then your mitochondria become too leaky. And at that point, your mitochondria are not producing just energy anymore, but they're actually producing free radicals.
Right.
And that's why if you go into the opposite extreme, which is now what the mainstream recommends to us with all those PUFAs from the vegetable oils, then you can create malfunctioning mitochondria, and that is a whole different type of problems.
Yeah.
So you don't want to go all the way to only eating saturated fats like butter and coconut oil. This is basically what the bulletproof diet propagates from
Dave Asprey.
What was his name? Yeah, Dave Asprey. There are a lot of people who have damaged their cells with too much saturated fatty acid intake. And this is where I am of the opinion that the carnivore diet is much better in that regard than the standard ketogenic diet, because the carnivore diet has a lot of meat in it, which has this perfect ratio between saturated and MUFA. And yeah, basically, yeah, that's
Yeah, I agree. Well, that explanation, I actually really like that explanation, because it encompassed a lot of nuanced views. So it was pretty insightful. And I didn't really think about it from that perspective, but it starts making more sense, I guess, especially if you look at these trials that they often conduct with PUFAs and saturated fat, where they feed both a hypercaloric diet consisting of high carbohydrate plus high saturated fat, and that combination doesn't sound particularly healthy for the cells. And then it's like, look, if you have both at the same time, then maybe those folks combining them will become more insulin resistant than the PUFA arm. But yeah, you actually provided a pretty nice explanation there, and yeah, that was quite interesting actually.
Yeah, and I'm also writing about that also on my Patreon. And I think it's always better to see those things with some infographics, because then it's easier to understand than just hearing it on a podcast. I mean, I'm trying my best, but I am someone who communicates better in the written form than in the spoken form, because in the written form I can also refine all those sentences. So yeah.
Right. No, that's good. That's perfect. The thing with seed oils also is it's like we need to differentiate between seed oils and PUFAs as such, because that's not the same thing at all. Like PUFAs means just polyunsaturated fatty acids, which has, well, obviously has something to do with seed oils, because seed oils are particularly rich in them. But like generally, if you talk about PUFAs and you think about fish and you think about nuts, etc., then there's nothing inherently wrong with eating those sorts of foods, because they're whole foods and you don't ingest like massive, ridiculous amounts of PUFAs. Whereas in seed oils, you don't only have that problem of too many polyunsaturated fatty acids, which might turn into a problem for you, too many of them, which is the case for virtually everything, apparently. But also you have the whole oxidation issue, right? Because in the production process, they get partially oxidized. Then they're sitting on the shelf for a while. They get even more oxidized. Then people use them to cook with. It's like perfect. Here you go, oxidation bomb.
Absolutely, yeah. And I am personally not a fan of nuts and seeds. So I almost never eat nuts and seeds. So maybe once in a blue moon.
Yeah.
They're definitely not part of my diet. So those would just be, some very rare exceptions.
Right, and that also makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint, because you never had the opportunity to grab a bag of walnuts and eat a whole bag at once. Like that was never the case. Maybe you passed a tree and you ate one or two nuts and you cracked them open with lots of effort, and that was that. That was the end of that story. You maybe had 2 nuts and that's it. Maybe 3 or 5 nuts every couple of weeks, but not like 500 grams of peanuts at once.
Fresh. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, fresh nuts. I mean, my grandparents, my late grandparents, they had an almond tree, and I would eat fresh almonds right from the tree. So they were still moist, and they were the freshest almonds I've ever had in my whole life, and they were amazing. And that is a whole different thing than those packaged almonds or those packaged nuts that you find in the grocery store. Yeah, what I wanted to say is, you don't need PUFAs to reverse that insulin resistance that you have gotten from too much saturated fatty acids. You can reverse that with MUFAs, with monounsaturated fatty acids. And MUFAs are much more safe because they don't oxidize. I mean, with the PUFAs, what you get is, you are making your the membrane of your cells become more penetrable again for insulin and other nutrients to get in. But the downside is that your mitochondria become so leaky that they start producing a lot of free radicals. So if you want to fix your cell membrane that has too many saturated fatty acids in there, I would do that not with PUFAs but with MUFAs.
Yeah.
So things like olive oil, or what else? Like macadamia.
Yeah. Macadamia nuts.
Yeah.
Or oil. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And
I mean, you have like meat high
also
in
don't.
MUFA, and fish is relatively high in. Well, there's also high in PUFA, but generally, like whole foods, they oftentimes they're not particularly high in anything specific. Like you have oftentimes a combination of everything. And if you want to, yeah, as you said, if you want to focus on MUFA specifically, then you have examples like macadamia or olives or olive oil. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So in general, you're gonna be pretty well if your main fat intake comes from the fat that is just naturally occurring in meat, because that has the perfect ratio. And if you don't stuff yourself with sticks of butter, you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think everything has to be assessed, in a more nuanced manner, because people they really enjoy like going all in one extreme idea, which is quite amusing actually. Like look like there's people who are crazy about nuts or these vegans. They're crazy about one particular thing. They don't do anything else but eat that. Then you have like
Yeah.
the bulletproof people. They're crazy about saturated fat. They drink fucking coffee with butter and coconut oil, and they just think it's only because it's not bad, as it turns out, it's not as bad as we thought, doesn't mean you should eat only that. It's like there's a
I mean,
difference between
I've done all
accepting that
that.
it's not harmful per se and eating only this one food. It's crazy to watch how it works in the real world.
I mean, I have been all of those people. I have been.
Same.
So I mean, as long as you don't become obsessed with it and destroy yourself in the concept, but as long as you realize if something does not work, that you can take a step back of that and say, all right, it's not working, then it's fine. The only problem is if you become obsessed with it and if you cannot rationally see that something is not working for you anymore. This
Well,
is
if it becomes part of your identity, right? If you become
yeah,
ideologically attached to that thing, and then it's part of you, and then you have to let go a part of you and to destroy an integral part of on which your whole belief system and the way you acted, the way you presented yourself was based on that idea. It's a religious idea fundamentally, and then suddenly you have to make a decision. Either you stick to it, and then like you have to live with the fact that you feel horrible, or you basically understand that you feel horrible and you decide to make a decision, but that might mean that you have to destroy the underlying belief system, which is difficult and people don't like
and you
doing
have
this.
to destroy maybe your identity that you have constructed around that diet. And especially if you're an influencer whose whole account is about, yeah, I'm the vegan guy, I'm
Yeah,
the keto guy.
like even the name, the Insta
Yeah,
name,
I
keto
mean,
this, carnivore this, vegan this. It's like, yeah.
yeah, I mean, Paul Saladino is not carnivore anymore. For hasn't been for a long time. So he eats plant products. He eats rice. He eats fruits.
Is it Paul?
So, huh?
You're talking about Paul?
Yes.
Yeah, right, exactly. But he
So
still
he
calls
is
himself carnivore MD,
he's
which
meat
is funny.
based, but he's not carnivore.
That's true.
He's the meat based MD. He's not a carnivore MD.
Right. That's interesting. That's really
Yeah.
interesting. I've had many conversations on exactly that topic already, and it's so fascinating to just discuss how it. I like thinking about how this happens, why people start falling for dogmatic belief systems, and why they seem not to come out of it. And I like thinking about it because I also had this happening to me. I was never attached to any particular diet, so I never followed anything in particular. I was always kind of omnivore, but shifting my focus. So I had the plant-based uh, era basically. I wasn't vegan or vegetarian even. I was still eating everything, but more like plants, way more plants. Then I found out about the low carb sphere and the keto sphere. And I was eating like less carbs. Then I was like, oh cool, there's like these crazy carnivore dudes. Let's try and eating more animal products. I actually enjoy the idea of eating more animal products for various reasons. But still, so I've been theoretically, like in my mind, I've visited these camps, and it's interesting. It's really interesting to be there and to think like these people, and then to detach yourself again, and you've gone to that same process basically.
I know, yeah. I have gone to the maximum extreme. So when I was vegan, I was the most crazy raw vegan you would have ever met. And I mean, I was never dogmatic. So I was only harsh with myself. And the same with keto. So I went fully zero carb for some time
Wow.
on keto. So I went to the max with all of those things. And I can totally understand the psychological principle that keeps you doing something, because it's basically like playing a slot machine where in the beginning you win, and
Yeah.
this is basically like it's psychologically hooking you to keep playing even if you lose.
Right.
So
Of
in
course.
terms of the raw vegan diet, yeah, when I started to be raw vegan, I I had amazing success in the beginning. So my skin sorry, my skin cleared up, and my tonsils, which have always been inflamed and always gave me trouble, all that stuff cleared up, so there was no inflammation anymore, and I could finally just have my body work without all those problems anymore. And that was a smashing success for me in the beginning. And I
Sounds
thought,
amazing.
yeah, this is the diet.
Mm.
And to have such a success in the beginning, yeah, you become blind to anything that is not working.
Mm.
That's basically like that's the same psychological principle that is at work when someone is playing the slot machine. In the beginning, the slot machine uh, spits out some money, and they're
Mm.
like, "Yeah, man, I'm winning." And then when they keep losing and losing and losing, they're still psychologically attached to those early experiences of winning.
Mm.
Then there is this what is it called? The I forgot the name, when you have little successes sprinkled here and there. What is it called? I forgot this.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I don't know what
But
it's
but
called right,
yeah,
but keeps
explain
you
it.
hooked. Yeah,
What was it?
I mean that thing keeps you hooked if you have those little positive experiences with it.
Oh yeah, so if you have like one maybe life-changing event that keeps kind of evoking these positive emotions about the intervention you implemented, and then you have random positive events that reinforce that behavior, right?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, so it's tough. It's tough, but maybe let's
Yeah.
get more reasonably practical at the end and summarize what exactly we could do. And I've one specific case for you, and I would like to hear your thoughts on that, because I've been asking you about those folks who don't seem insanely overweight, maybe even normal weight, and are still, they present themselves with some extent of insulin resistant. And oftentimes these people are maybe older, and they're more like, skinny old people. Like imagine like a skinny old man who has not
Oh,
much fat to lose anymore, but he's diabetic. It's like I had that in one of my practices in medical school, on a cardio what was that, cardiological station, I think it was. And then it was quite fascinating because he wasn't even normal
type
weight.
two,
I think he was
type,
slightly, sorry.
type 2 diabetes.
He had type 2 diabetes. He definitely had
Yeah.
type 2 diabetes, and he was even using insulin, and he wasn't overweight at all. And I thought, what would imagine a patient who is normal weight, who's old, and that's an important addition to the patient. He's old, and he hasn't that much fat to lose anymore. He's still type 2 diabetic. And how would you proceed with that sort of patient? Because losing weight would be a dangerous approach. Since old people, they lose a lot of muscle. If you ask them to lose a lot of weight, then they will like lose even more muscle, which will increase their already
Yeah,
accelerated loss of muscle mass, which is like the worst thing you could imagine for an old person.
I know. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would have to see what diet he is on. I think that he's probably just gonna have some standard BS, quote unquote healthy diet, which has lots of PUFAs and vegetable oils. So I would get him off those PUFAs. I would put him on a high protein animal foods diet. And I would also make sure that he gets a lot of micronutrients. So he
Yeah.
would have to get lots of organ meats and minerals and oysters and stuff like that. Because I think that the reason why his insulin receptors are not working properly anymore is because, number one, he doesn't have the cofactors, like the vitamins and the minerals. And number two, the PUFAs have destroyed his insulin receptors.
Yeah, right. So that's on the nutritional front. And I think that's something for people to take as a take-home message, regardless of their weight status, let's say, that the nutrient status is an important one, and the avoidance of too high PUFA intake. Just like, let's say, just avoid processed foods, and you'll get rid of most of the excess PUFA intake, and then you can implement more. I think that's like rule number one. Get rid of all the get rid of all the processed foods, and you maybe solved a large percentage of your issues. And look, another thing I think which is underappreciated is strength training or exercise in general, but I think a particular strength training.
Absolutely.
So what can we say about that?
So yeah, he should go into. So he should approach it from a reasonable intensity standpoint. So just get under the power rack and squat. I mean, but do some strength training. It can even be some body weight stuff.
Yeah.
Things like lunges, stuff like that. But yeah, he definitely needs to also use those non-insulin dependent GLUT4 vesicles.
Absolutely. I think that's so underappreciated if you just think about it for a second, especially for old people, because they're at higher risk of falling and fractures.
Oh, yeah,
and you know, imagine they fall and they end up in the hospital and they die from some stupid infection that they could have avoided that with more muscle mass. You know, it's I've been thinking about it, and it's just insane. I mean, I think if there's one thing an old person should do for 20 reasons, or even way more than that, is to do strength training, engage in some serious physical exercise that the body can handle, obviously, at that point in time, because like old people, they generally they can hardly move, but whatever they can do, they should do with their body, especially with their muscles.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, because if you don't have that input or that strength training signaling, your bones are also going to suffer a lot, and then those people are then suffering from osteoporosis, and then they just fall one time and boom, their hip bone is gone.
Yeah, and that's the end of that story, oftentimes. And also, like from a diabetic perspective, you have more capacity to store glycogen. I mean, isn't that a cool thing? You can handle more carbohydrates at once because you can store more in your muscles. So that's another great benefit. Right. So we have strength training. We have maybe low carb / low fat. What's that?
High micronutrient intake, low intake, or no intake of those vegetable oils, and also a high protein intake. So older people need more protein.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's definitely right. Like also from a muscle mass perspective and for losing weight. Like if people lose weight and they want to keep their muscle mass, which they should, like it's the only thing you should focus on is like lose weight, great, but please keep your muscle mass for all kinds of reasons. And then a high protein diet definitely helps.
Yeah, the older you become, the more protein you need.
Oh yeah.
I mean, children need very little protein. Children love sugar and
Yep.
fat
Yep.
as their primary macronutrients. Also, when you look at breast milk, it doesn't have that much protein, but it has more sugar and more fat because that activates the renal cycle and makes children grow. And yeah, that's one thing that I also wanted to mention. A lot of people have messaged me and asked me, so should I put my child on a renal cycle specific diet where they don't consume carbs and fats anymore at the same time? And I'm telling you, no, don't do that. Because children need to combine those two macronutrients because it's the best way to grow.
Yeah, you're right about that. And it's hard for people to grapple with the idea that older people actually require more protein. And I see that with my grandma and with my father. He's a bit older than the conventional average father. And I like tell him all the time, and especially my grandma, because she bought into the idea that high protein diets are unhealthy. This horrible, like disgusting myth. And I try to explain, and it's difficult, that the older you get, the more you have to eat for like 10 reasons at once, one of which is that you're worse at absorbing protein, so you need more to compensate for that. Then you lose muscle mass, which means you require more protein to compensate for that. And like the diabetic thing, you want to preserve your muscles and maybe build some more to dispose of glucose and to prevent fractures. So it's like the best thing you can do when you're old is strength train and eat as much protein as you can get your hands on.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
for people, let's say there's someone who actually does suffer from some kidney problems. In that case, then you would have to take free amino acids.
Yeah.
But you have to get those proteins in. You need protein.
Okay. You're absolutely
Yeah.
right about that. There's one last question before I let you go, because we've been talking for like 90 minutes or a bit more than that. What do you think about creatine? I've been thinking about creatine recently, especially as a supplement for older people. But what's your thoughts on this thing?
Yeah, creatine is great, but there are some people who are non-responders to creatine. I would just test it out.
So you would say it's like either there's a benefit or there was just no benefit. But how about harm? Is there anything you could do wrong?
So I would try it out, and there is definitely a benefit for many people, but there are some people who are not non-responders. But I mean, if you eat lots of animal protein,
Yeah.
you would usually get a certain amount of creatine. So
That's right.
you can use it, but it's not the most important thing.
I've been thinking more about like older people, my grandma, or like, because I've read some scientific stuff about cognitive benefits of creatine. It's not just the muscle mass and the muscle strength. It also has some other benefits beyond that, which I found very interesting. So it's on that front more.
Yeah, I would just say try it out
Yeah.
and see what happens.
Yeah. I think there's not much you can do wrong with creatine, it seems, because it's so well researched and there's almost no harmful adverse effects.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so I think that's a good place to stop. We have covered a lot. I think we've covered really much today, and it's been quite comprehensive.
I'm in heat right now. I didn't turn on the fan because that would be too loud. But man, I am dying of heat right now. Also, my computer is pretty hot right now.
Yeah, so on many levels, it's a good place to stop.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of things.
That's true. That's true. And I mean, you answered many of my questions, and there's definitely room to dive even deeper. And that's what I try to achieve with this podcast, because there's so much stuff which I don't understand, and I just hope that there are people out there that can help me understand things better. So thanks for your time, and please tell people where they can find more about your stuff.
So yeah, you can find me on Instagram at mo.magnan. So that is mo.magnan. So it's not Magnum, but Magnon. And then you can also find me on Patreon. So if you want to get a deeper insight into those topics, especially with some infographics. I mean, I'm sharing a lot of infographics on Instagram. It's basically my
Yeah.
whole account, it's just infographics. Aside of my profile picture, you never see me. But the thing is, Instagram is limited to only those 10 slides per post. But if you want to have really deep dive articles that are usually about 8,000 words long, then you want to visit my Patreon, which is patreon.com/mo_magnan, or my blog, which is momagnan.com, without any dot or without any underscore. So this is where you can find me. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I'll link everything for the people in the description so they can go and check it out. I think your wealth of information in that sense, and there is a lot of stuff you can even take a look at your Instagram account. There's a bunch of stuff there, and you don't even have to if you want to get to know anything and you want to expand your knowledge, just take a look at your account and you'll be done for a while, because there's a lot of information packed there.
Yeah. And then from there, you can go on.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. One thing that I have forgotten to mention, my book,
Right.
The Stretch Mark Secret. It also has its own dedicated Instagram account, Stretch Mark Secret. And this is the book where I talk about the fact that stretch marks are not the result of overstretched skin. That is a myth. The very term stretch mark is a misnomer. And that is another rabbit hole of information.
Oh yeah, that sounds like a rabbit hole.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, but we didn't manage to. Yeah, I completely forgot about that, but we didn't manage to talk about your
Yeah,
book that much.
that's a whole different topic.
Yeah, we might do another conversation another time.
Absolutely, in the future, yeah.
Awesome. So, yeah, let's stop here. Thanks a lot for the conversation. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Likewise, yeah, thank you for having me on the show, and looking forward to seeing the release. And yeah,
Awesome.
and then talk to you soon, maybe in another episode in a couple of weeks.
Of course. We'll definitely make a part 2.
Yeah, all right.
All right, take care.